Okay, everyone, well, welcome back to the public lecture course, week 2. It's great to see so many of you here again, and I feel like we're building a real Entangled Histories team. It's really nice to have that moment before the lecture to just chat and share ideas, so thank you, Nermin and Tabrani, for organising that, and I'm really delighted to welcome one of those people that I said we would ask to join our conversation to build up this idea and stretch the idea of Entangled Histories across our 5 weeks of our course. And this week we're going to hear from Rosie Dias, who is Associate Professor in the Department of History of Art at Warwick University. Rosie's a great friend of the Paul Mellon Centre, so we have worked with her over a number of years, publishing her book and having many talks from her. But it was really through conversations about some new teaching projects that Rosie has embarked on recently and structured a course called East Meets West, which is about colonial and post-colonial India, and just really interesting conversations thinking about how people are teaching Entangled Histories in the university, and also recent research projects thinking about the entangled histories of the East India Company and the political cultures of art history in the 18th and 19th century. So I won't say too much more because Rosie will take us through this idea of the East India Company at home. And as we said last week, we're thinking about these different locations, these different sites of entanglement, and the idea of the institutional being one of those key areas in which South Asia meets Britain. So Rosie, welcome to the public lecture course, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and I'd like to thank Sarah and Hamad for the very kind invitation to come and speak at this very exciting programme of events. So my lecture tonight deals with the entangled histories of Britain and South Asia through the lens, of course, of the East India Company and its visual culture in 18th and early 19th century. And of course, in this period, it makes sense to think about those entangled histories through the East India Company, because the company was almost exclusively the means through which the British public encountered India in this period. It brought prized exotic commodities back to Britain on an unprecedented scale. And indeed, we could argue that much of the development of Georgian London came about through the trade and the consequent dispersal of wealth that the East India Company set into motion. But the company was also the means through which images and information about India circulated in Britain and was filtered by the company as well. So I'll be signalling tonight some of the ways in which visual culture conceived of that entanglement between Britain and Asia, in terms of commerce and politics, in an era when the relationship between Britain and the subcontinent moves from a trading relationship to something that's more imperial in flavour. I should perhaps just start with a little bit of basic information about the East India Company. Just bear with me if you're already familiar with this, but I don't want anyone to be confused about what the company was and what it did. So the East India Company was a trading company which was established by Royal Charter in 1600 by Elizabeth I, who essentially granted the company a monopoly over the Asia trade. And in 1601, this man here, James Lancaster, commands a voyage to Asia. And initially, it was the spice trade in Indonesia that the company had its eye on. However, the Dutch East India Company was already heavily embedded in that region, and so the British East India Company, or the English East India Company at that point, moves the focus of its activity to South Asia, and it sets up a commercial treaty with the Mughal emperor It sets up a settlement in Surat initially, and then in Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta. So when many of us, I suspect, think about the East India Company's visibility in London, the most perhaps the most conspicuous, widely talked about event, the moment at which the company really came to the fore in the public imagination, we might think about the 1851 Great Exhibition, and many of us, of course, are familiar with these images of the exhibition itself, and also with some of the objects that were exhibited at that exhibition, which today have afterlives in the V&A and the Royal Collection, objects like miniature paintings, woven silks, enamelled spice boxes, to items which really captured the public imagination, like the Kohinoor diamond, Ranjit Singh's throne, the beautifully carved ivory throne sent to Queen Victoria by the Maharaja of Travancore in the Royal Collection. The India Court at the Great Exhibition was organised by the company, by an employee of the company, John Forbes Royal, who was a botanist, and as we might expect, he took a very painstaking approach to categorising and arranging the objects of display, raw and manufactured products, but also objects that don't really fit into that category, which were perhaps trophy objects acquired from leaders that the company had deposed. And what I find really interesting about this exhibition is the way in which trade and imperialism are displayed alongside each other as if they were one and the same thing. And I think it makes sense then to start thinking about how this comes to be and how in that earlier period, which we're perhaps less familiar with, that balance of trade and imperialism shifts and sort of eventually reaches this point. Before I get to thinking about artworks, I just wanted to point out that throughout the 17th century and in the first half of the 18th century, the British public's encounter with Asia was primarily came about through its consumption of exotic commodities imported by the East India Company, so consumables like spices, coffee and tea, but perhaps most visibly textiles, particularly silks, and cottons or chintzes. Chintz becomes quite controversial in the 18th century. It's banned by the British government in 1720 against a controversy that the local manufacturers felt they couldn't compete with these desirable imported goods. And another very prized commodity, of course, was Chinese porcelain. In Britain, the taste for porcelain was often satirised and criticised. Its consumption was seen as being something of a marker of female weakness, desire, and superficiality. I really love this portrait, this 18th century Dutch portrait, where this woman has chosen to have herself depicted with her porcelain vase, a sign perhaps of how desirable these objects were. A recent book by the art historian Julie Hochstrasser has unpacked and revealed the histories of such commodities which pervade Dutch still life painting in particular. So she looks at porcelain, pepper, tobacco, sugar, objects like these, and how they were manufactured, traded, marketed, and consumed. And she accounts for their visibility in the visual culture, Dutch visual culture of the 17th century. But I think we need to question the extent to which consumers understood their connection to commodities' origins and to the cultures in which they originated. And porcelain is a great example of this because its technique was, of course, highly secretive. But other goods, I would argue, also conceal the processes of their manufacture and the local and personal histories which they contain. And it's not really until the second half of the 18th century that the British public envisages India in a more direct fashion. The moment at which this comes about is roughly around the mid-century, following the Battle of Plassey, which was a turning point really in Britain's relationship with India, a moment at which Britain starts to adopt a more territorial relationship with the continent. At this point, British artists have not yet been to India, so they're envisaging that relationship rather indirectly through written accounts or through oral histories. What's very interesting, though, is that this imagery starts very quickly to emerge into public spaces of leisure. So in Vauxhall Gardens, the pleasure gardens, the annex to the music room, I think you can just see that there are, just over here on each side, there are very large picture frames, empty at this point, I think, but the Hayman painting of Lord Clive meeting Mir Jaffa is one of the very large-scale canvases depicting episodes from the 7 Years' War that ends up in those frames. And there's a very strong sense in which the East India Company avails itself of the emerging exhibition culture in the second half of the 18th century in London. The first British artist to go out to India was Tilly Kettle. He was a theatrical painter. He stayed in India for 7 years. He starts off in Madras and moves to Faizabad and Calcutta. And he envisaged a new opportunity, really, for patronage, and not only patronage from the East India Company, but also local rulers who he does paint along with their families. And he displays some of these canvases in the Society of Artists and at the Royal Academy exhibitions in the 1770s and 80s. And these paintings really caused a stir in London. They were really the first opportunity that the public had to envisage or to see a realistic representation of or what they believed was a realistic representation of a Mughal ruler. And I sort of inject a kind of sense of scepticism into that, because there is a sense in which Kettle does sort of play up the sort of theatricality of his scenes for a local audience. He plays up the idea of the fabulously wealthy Eastern ruler dripping in pearls and with his huge sword indicating perhaps the sort of sense of despotism with which the Mughal dynasty were often characterized in writings in the 17th and 18th centuries. So Tilly Kettle obtains patronage from local rulers, but also from the East India Company. So this particular portrait of the Nawab of Arcot was bought by, not by the Nawab himself, but actually by Warren Hastings, who went on to be the Governor-General of the East India Company. Other of Kettle's works really envisage the sense of a diplomatic relationship between the company's officials and the local rulers with which they engage. So General Robert Barker, who we see over here in the military uniform, commissioned this work as a pendant to another work in which he formed a treaty of alliance with the Kingdom of Oud. And these two pendant paintings were intended to be displayed in his country home when he returned to Britain. But along the way, it was also exhibited at the Royal Academy. What's quite interesting here is the date of this painting, actually. And Barker had long since returned to Britain by this point, and this was an event that was very much in the past. So there's already a sense in which the company officials are creating a sense of history of the British relationship with India. In the 1780s and 90s, the sort of the visual output of British artists in India accelerates greatly. And if we take 1787 as an example, this is a year when one artist, William Hodges, exhibits 7 works at the Royal Academy, including this view of a mosque at Raj Mahal, which you can see just on the back wall here in the detail. And as well as exhibiting at the Royal Academy, Hodges has his works aquatinted. So this particular view was aquatinted for a publication called Select Views in India. And again, the historical narrative that develops around this image is really quite interesting. He describes, first of all, the Mughal origins of this building, thought by Hodges to have been built by Sultan Suja, the son of Shah Jahan. But he then goes on to signal its importance for British endeavours in India. So he tells us that after the Battle of Buxar, the company's troops lodged in this building. And this was a moment, Hodges tells us, the Battle of Buxar, which effectively gave the British complete control of the Kingdom of Bengal. So again, we get this sense of a history of British endeavour in India starting. In addition to availing themselves of the exhibition culture of 18th century London, artists, and increasingly amateur artists as well, started to establish networks of publishing and aquatinting and lithography. What's interesting here is that a lot of these artists are not professional artists, but are figures who are involved in the East India Company either as military officers or as administrators. And often they were very accomplished draftsmen, and during leisure time produced watercolour sketches typically of their experiences. They attempted to give a sense of their experiences in the company's service. Charles Doily, for example, was an administrator in the Bengal Civil Service, and his publications, which include views of Calcutta and its environs, and also a sort of semi-satirical illustrated poem called The Adventures of Tom Raw, where he describes the mishaps of a young cadet in the East India Company's service. These publications are very concerned to give a flavour of the British experience in India. More typically, amateur artists would produce rural landscape views for publication. Charles Ramus Forrest, another employee of the East India Company, produced a series of views depicting points along the rivers Ganges and Yamuna. And he was very keen to flag up the authenticity of his works. So he in the preface, notes that these were all works that were taken on the spot, not only drawn on the spot, but also coloured or tinted on the spot in order to really capture this the environment that he travelled. So increasingly, the British public is coming to see images of India, but it's also the case that there comes to be, from the 1770s onwards, perhaps a more direct political relationship between Britain and India. And on the left, we can see the politician Henry Dundas, who is shown with one foot in Leadenhall Street, the headquarters of the East India Company, and the other in Bengal. So the implication is that his political activities in Britain are very much motivated with an eye to the fabulous riches that India offer. And this caused a lot of consternation from the 1770s onwards, and particularly with what was perceived of as a rise of the so-called nabob class. So the nabobs were East India Company employees who had acquired huge riches through their employment in the company's service. They returned to Britain enriched and typically brought country estates. And perhaps the most infamous example of this is this man, Paul Benfield, who went out to India in 1764 as a sort of a humble civil servant and returns home several years later with a fortune of £500,000, which I think would be roughly in the region of £5 million today. And he sort of acquires that fortune through private trade and also through loans to local rulers at exorbitant rates of interest. He not only enters Parliament, but he's able to fund seats for 8 other members of Parliament as well. And this causes a great deal of consternation. So Edmund Burke, the politician, for example, complains about how these people are coming home with all their money, they're buying an estate, they're marrying into the aristocracy, and then they enter Parliament. And I think there's a little bit more than a sort of snobbery vis-a-vis new money there. I mean, I think today, if perhaps something like Google or Amazon started sort of inserting people with their interests into Parliament, it would quite rightly cause a great deal of consternation. The sense was that this was destabilising to the British state, largely because these men were seen very often as corrupt. And what's sort of quite ironic is that they're seen as corrupt not because of their own behaviour, but because there is something inherently corrupting about being in the So I just want to think a little bit about the physical fabric of the East India Company in London. By the end of the 18th century, the company's administrative headquarters and their storage facilities were contained almost exclusively, with the exception of the docks at Blackwall, within a very small area of London, which extended from the quays just by the Custom House in Lower Thames Street, up to Cutler Street, just off Houndsditch, which is just north of the centre of this map, and then from west to east from Bishopsgate, and then to Hayden Square in the east. And we can see we get a sense of the economic and social ascendancy of the East India Company by looking at the buildings in which it inhabited. So it started out at the beginning of the 17th century in the home of its first governor, effectively, Sir Thomas Smythe. By 1721, it moves to Crosby House on Bishopsgate, and then in 1648 to Craven House on Leadenhall Street, which is this building on the left. And it remains there for 80 years, and it sort of becomes very enmeshed in the urban culture of 18th century London, and also controversy of 17th century London. In 1661, it installs this superstructure that you see at the top with the painted ships and the merchant, the figure of the merchant. This is to celebrate the coronation of Charles II. So it's installed a few days before that. And then in 1697, it becomes the focus of controversy as the Spitalfields weavers attack the building because they're unhappy about the import of silks. Eventually, the company outgrows Craven House, and it moves to this new building designed by Theodore Jacobson, who's a merchant and amateur architect. It was completed in 1729, but it's not long again before further extensions are needed. And during the 1790s, the company acquires and pulls down buildings to either side of the original building, and it employs the company surveyor, Richard Jupp, to design the new interior space and the facade. It's completed in 1799, and that gives the company space for its very wide-ranging activities. So it has administrative and committee rooms, it has a wine cellar, sale room, and a library. So as you can see, the enlarged Palladian edifice consisted now of 15 bays, and the upper stories were unified with a single window. And it removed Jacobson's original Doric columns and triglyphs in favour of a very substantial Ionic portico with a clear sculptural programme. And although this is a commercial building, it very much has the flavour of a public or civic kind of institution. What's interesting there is that there's nothing in the architectural style which would suggest a relationship between Britain and India. There were buildings in the city which did do so, and an example of this is George Dance the Younger's Gothic porch for the Guildhall. I'm thinking in particular of this sort of section of the facade, which drew upon a view by William Hodges, which back in Britain was known as Hindu Gothic, although it's actually a connection between Islamic and Gothic architecture that Hodges and Dance are most interested in. There's a number of reasons, really, why perhaps a neoclassical facade was more appropriate for East India House than perhaps a more hybrid kind of structure. This might be because in the 1790s, company policy enforces a much clearer racial separations and hierarchies within its political, administrative and social affairs. It tries to reverse some of the entanglements of British and Indian culture that had occurred in the 1760s, 70s and 80s. For example, when company officials in places like Lucknow went native. However, India, or the relationship with India, was contained within the building's pediment by John Bacon the Elder, which was suggestive, really, of the East India Company's position at the time. What Bacon does here is to yoke together an assemblage of real and allegorical and mythological figures. So at the centre of the frieze here, we have the figure of Britannia, who has a cap of liberty on her staff, and she embraces a figure who is supposed to represent liberty, and then holding a shield of protection over them is the King, George III, in Roman dress. On Britannia's other side is the figure of Mercury, who represents commerce, and he's attended by Navigation, who points out to Britannia this figure of Asia, sort of pouring this cornucopia of riches at her feet. On the other side, we have the figure of Order, behind her, Religion and Justice, and then to the right, figures representing industry and integrity. And then at the angles of the pediment, we have figures representing the Thames on the right and then the Ganges on the left. There were precedents for this kind of iconography, and the most obvious one perhaps is the town hall in Amsterdam, or what is now the Royal Palace, which similarly aligned commercial and civic imperatives through its pediment frieze by the Flemish sculptor Artus Quilinus. And at the centre, I'm sorry, these images are not great. It's quite hard to find a good image of this pediment. But at the centre of the composition, we have a figure of Amsterdam who is receiving trade from Europe, Africa, Asia, and America. And there's a lot in common with the East India House pediment. Like Britannia, Amsterdam is flanked by two rivers, the Amstel and the Aa. There's no Mercury, but no figure of Mercury, but his caduceus is worn by Amsterdam himself. And in the Amsterdam pediment, the continents are accompanied by animals, elephants and parrots, and also specific goods like incense and tulips. An industry which we remember was personified in a sort of allegorical form by John Bacon here is given more literal form. So there are men hauling goods or working in South American silver mines. And perhaps thinking about a more local and recent precedent for John Bacon's iconography, we can look to the Revenue Committee Room of East India House itself. What we see here is a consistent iconography of commerce and of tribute, both of which accommodate Britannia, incorporate Britannia and overflowing gifts, personified rivers and continents, and in Spiridone Roma's case, the familiar figure of Mercury. However, Bacon's pediment doesn't just draw upon those iconographies and sculptural programmes, and neither is it simply facilitating the architectural expression of an iconographical programme that was already established within East India House. What's notable here is that unlike its precedents, this pediment features at the very centre a reigning monarch. And this, and the inclusion of other allegorical figures, so liberty, justice, integrity, which until now are really quite extraneous to the imagery of commerce, suggests perhaps something of a new approach to this subject matter. And it's, perhaps we might suggest, an approach that's necessitated by recent debates and legislation around the role, the activities, and also the morality of East India trading. And the result of those debates is, we could argue, a renewed attempt on the part of the East India Company to address moral and constitutional concerns through a very careful calibration of architectural and urban space. So the 1780s were really a very critical time for the company. During that decade, it faced arguably its most serious moral and constitutional crisis to date. And there were two key events, the first of which was the passing of the East India Company Act in 1784. And then the following year, the announcement of Warren Hastings' impeachment on his return to Britain on charges of corruption. And the resulting trial over 7 years brought to the public's attention the nature, the extent, and the moral failures of company policy. And a key player in both of those events was the politician Edmund Burke. So in 1783, he makes a very lengthy speech in Parliament in which he assesses the extensive crimes he alleges that the East India Company has committed. And this is a speech which runs to 35,000 words. And in 1786, he opens the impeachment proceedings against Hastings by reading out a series of charges which lasts for 2 days. It's important to mention that Burke wasn't against Britain's colonial presence and expansion in India. And he didn't either believe that it was essentially wrong in any way to leave such extensive political powers in the hands of a company of merchants. The problem essentially for him was the company's monopoly, and that was something that caused quite a lot of consternation to many commentators, including the sort of free trade advocates like Adam Smith, who believed that this was really the worst kind of trading. But for Burke, the problem was really one to do with fundamental rights. And he believed that while the Magna Carta effectively established the rights of men and their liberties, he believed that it was a charter to restrain power and destroy monopoly. There was something of a constitutional contradiction in the Crown giving a monopoly to the East India Company, which he believed was a charter to establish monopoly and to create power. And this charter that was effectively granted by Parliament implicated Parliament itself in those corruptions. They couldn't look away, Burke argued, while these kinds of crimes were being committed. And Burke supports Charles James Fox's India Bill of 1783. That bill is defeated, but the following year an act is passed based on legislation proposed by the new Prime Minister, William Pitt. And the 1784 Act, East India Act, effectively curtailed the power of the East India Company and made it subject to a board of control that was run by government figures. So it was essentially, it created a partnership of Crown and Company through which the Governor-General was ostensibly in charge of British India, but under the authority of the British government. Those events in 1784 were widely reported in the press, and they also featured very prominently in the visual culture of that year, particularly in graphic satire. So as an example here, we have a print which is supportive of Fox's India Bill, and we see Fox, he's holding a peep box that that is a representation of East India House, and as the legend tells us, concealed within it are diabolical murders committed in India, and this idea is reinforced by three figures on the top of the box: an East India Company employee brandishing a cutlass in one hand, a kneeling Indian in the other, and then next to him another Indian, headless this time, is offering gifts. Prints that were more critical of Fox's interventions tended to characterise his conduct as financially motivated, a tussle between company and crown for the very substantial wealth that Asian trade and revenue extraction could reap. So here we see Fox rather shiftily carrying through a gateway surmounted by a crown, a box of, again representing East India House, and falling out of it are various bills and stocks. The consequences of all this were then revealed several years later or commented upon by other graphic satirists. Here we see some consequences of Pitt's legislation. Britannia, burdened with taxes, Justice dropping her scales and sword as she's beaten by the Lord Chancellor, Edward Thurlow, and William Pitt rides sedately on an ass that has the face of Henry Dundas, the president of the company's board of control, and they're trampling over bills that with the words rights, charters, privileges on them. And again, East India House itself features very prominently in this print, and there's a sign on the left saying that it's to let, the present inhabitants having to effectively to downsize. Skip over. So what we can, actually I'm going to go, we'll have a quick look at this one. Perhaps even more extensively commented on was the trial of Warren Hastings, leading to his acquittal eventual acquittal 7 years later in 1795. And this acquittal was celebrated in a print that was dedicated to the East India Company. And here we see Commerce in a white dress. She's attended by Plenty. She calls upon Britannia, who's flanked by Liberty and Justice, to do honour to Hastings, who we're told is the preserver of Britannia's empire in the East. What we can see when we return to Bacon's frieze is that these, the new figures that appear here, the figures of liberty, justice, and integrity, alongside those more conventional figures of commerce and navigation, are perhaps a response to issues that had been raised and widely debated in the years surrounding the India Bills and Act, and the trial of Hastings. And it perhaps recognises the visibility of old East India House in graphic satires, and it attempts to actively address those criticisms through alternative iconographies and counter-narratives on the facade of the building itself. Also want to just quickly give you a sense of what was inside the building, because it very much supports that idea of sort of reform and trying to rehabilitate the company in the public imagination. What's really interesting is that the sales room, which is where all the sort of, all the kind of selling and bartering takes place, has this very ambitious sculptural program at the upper level. So there are niches incorporating sculpted figures of key figures in the East India Company's history, from Robert Clive through to Cornwallis, and nearly all of them are dressed again in Roman costume. From the early 19th century, the company also had a museum in East India House, which was open to the public for free 1 day a week, And it contains a really interesting amalgamation of objects from books and manuscripts, miniature paintings, Hindu sculpture, the kinds of textiles that the company traded, and also objects of what was called at the time objects of curiosity, things like the figure, the Tipu's tiger, which some of you might be familiar with from the Victoria and Albert Museum, an object which was acquired in 1799 at the conclusion of the Anglo-Mysore Wars when the East India Company looted the summer palace of the local leader Tipu Sultan, and there's a sense in which these objects of trade really exist cheek by jowl with objects that have a more political nature, that are trophy objects taken after victories, key victories. In addition to the museum, what I find quite interesting is the extent to which the company was willing to engage with a more popular form of visual culture. So while it's exhibiting works, or its employees are exhibiting works in the Royal Academy and the Society of Artists, while this museum attempts to disseminate knowledge of India to the London public, they also participated in more spectacular forms of entertainment. So the Egyptian Hall on Piccadilly was built by William Bullock in the early 19th century, and it very much became a place of resort for quite lowbrow but popular entertainments. And in 1826, an item that's displayed there is the imperial state carriage and throne that is taken from the Emperor of Burma after the conclusion of the First Anglo-Burmese War. And so this sort of huge, impressive object is exhibited with model elephants sort of positioned as if they were pulling the carriage. And it's also accompanied by a very extensive pamphlet that explains to the visitor the making of the object, the history of it, how it's acquired by the British, the political relationship between the East India Company and Burma as well. So I'm just going to conclude. We sort of got a very broad sense of the visual culture surrounding the East India Company in 18th and early 19th century London. And I wanted to give you that broad sense because it was a very broad visual culture and very prolific. And compared with other European East India companies, the extent to which the British East India Company engaged with image making and with the dissemination of such imagery was really quite astonishing. So professional artists, as we've seen, exploited new opportunities for patronage, and the works that they produced flowed into the metropolis, partaking of the new exhibition culture that emerged in the second half of the 18th century. Amateur artists, many of them who were employees of the East India Company, recorded their experiences in pencil and in watercolour, and they established networks with lithographers, aquatinters, and print publishers back in London. And the East India Company's headquarters in Leadenhall Street surpassed in scale and in ambition and in its sculptural didacticism the equivalent buildings of other European trading companies. And the expansion of the company's East India Museum, which I should say becomes progressively larger and larger, and particularly after the Great Exhibition of 1851, it's then entirely sort of refitted and objects from the Great Exhibition installed therein. So the expansion of that museum offers a really telling inversion of the cliche of the modern museum where one exits through the shop. Here, the museum has effectively been added to the shop. And a lot of this activity was couched in the terms of enlightenment and then its Victorian successor, the ordering of knowledge. But of course, there's something also rather more instrumental at work here, as we've seen in relation to Bacon's sculpture for the new East India House. As we're finding out today, international trade is a complicated business. It's not only tricky, but it's intensely political and it's often controversial, with an inherent power structure operating between the players involved. And the moment at which the new East India House was constructed and the period during which so much apparently descriptive imagery of India was produced by British artists was very much an evolutionary, transitional moment. It certainly wasn't neat. And as that trading relationship between Britain and India began to shift to a colonial one, there wasn't much of a clear sense of what such a colonialism might actually look like. So perhaps empire meant empire in the same way as Brexit means Brexit, which is to say that either no one knows what the hell it means or everyone has their own version of it. So while Bacon's pediment frieze for East India House literally set in stone a conceptual formula for a trading and political relationship between Britain and India in the aftermath of company reform in the 1780s, the reality was rather less definitive. So like the 1851 Great Exhibition's Indian Court, East India House may have presented trade and empire as if they were one and the same thing, but the permutations of Britain's relationship with India had yet to be worked out. So in short, imagery of India that could be encountered in London in this period offered a stability and a sense of resolution that certainly was not replicated in the politics and conception of empire itself.
Thank you, Rosie. That has to be one of the clearest discussions and introductions to the visual cultures and political cultures of the East India Company I've ever heard. So I'm enormously grateful to you because it sorted out so many kind of parts of this multifaceted history of a company making itself and the image of itself and how it's using imagery and objects to enter into public culture and using the surfaces of buildings on the street, facing the street, to make that image of itself and its relationship with the world or entering people's homes to be consumed in various ways. So I think you really gave us a sense of how the company is embedding itself through visual and material culture into British life in so many ways. And that was just, very powerfully imaged here on the screen through the prints as well. So I'm sure people have questions, and as with all the public lecture courses, we want to kind of leave plenty of time for discussion and clarification, to ask questions. So I will open the floor and see if anyone wants to ask Rosie anything while she's here. Hamad, jump in.
Well, thank you so much for that, Rosie. And I was really struck by some of these comparisons you were making right towards the end. And of course, the obvious thing that came straight to mind was, say, things like the Google Cultural Institute, where we have another kind of an imperial structure, which is also entering into the cultural realm. And one of the issues with Google has been, what people can see when they search. And again, thinking about what people can see, what India they see, is in some ways being controlled by the East India Company. So my question really was, how much of that control could they exercise, and what were their means? So, for example, the amateur artists or even the professional artists, Could you sort of paint us a picture of what other avenues there could be of people accessing or consuming a visual India other than what was controlled by the East India Company?
That's a really excellent question. And I think it's fair to say that much of the visual culture was controlled by the East India Company, but not necessarily directly. There were occasions when that control was direct. So there are certain artists, and William Hodges is one of them, who are patronised directly by the company. Either they produce landscape paintings, or particularly in the sort of era of war, during the Anglo-Mysore Wars, for example, artists are commissioned to. So Robert Home is commissioned to accompany Cornwallis on his sort of military escapades, and to produce history paintings which are sent back to Britain. But of course, company patronage was not simply the sort of official company patronage, but it also was exerted through individuals. So people like, we saw General Robert Barker, who commissioned portraits for their own consumption. And then we have these amateur artists who are professionally working under the remit of the East India Company, but these publications are produced within a space of leisure, to the extent to which that can actually be demarcated off their own steam. But really, I mean, because the company controlled who went to India effectively, it did have a lot of direct and indirect control over the image of India that was presented back in London.
And what about the images that were perhaps being developed by the Dutch or the French or the Portuguese? Were they finding circulation back in Britain?
What's really interesting, from what I can, as far as I can ascertain, is that there simply isn't the scale of artistic production in relation to those colonial endeavours that there was with the British East India Company. If we take the Dutch, for example, at one point they send a lot of artists to Dutch Brazil, but Asia is not sort of, and that's really because of the interest of the governor who was overseeing the Brazilian colony. But in terms of Asia, there isn't that sort of concentrated visual production that we get with the British East India Company, and that's true with other European trading companies as well.
It's interesting to see how that image, though, breaks down under the scrutiny of the satirist, and how political satire and prints are used to really, sort of break down this image of the East India Company in kind of ways that are, those prints are still so funny and biting, aren't they? The satire is...
But I think what's also interesting about those is the extent to which the company is so acutely aware of them and wants to deal with those kinds of criticisms, and the way in which you see a lot of those figures that appear in the allegorical prints, like Britannia and figures of liberty and justice, how they eventually end up on that pediment in East India House.
Was the mission of the East India Company, was it ever explicitly stated that this was a civilizing mission?
Not
I mean, in the imagery it is, but was it ever... I know in the Raj it was, but they weren't converting people. They weren't. I mean, what was the?
Well, the company was very much against missionaries going out to India in the way that they had done under the Dutch and the Portuguese, and they managed to hold that off for a period of time. But there's a lot of pressure within Britain from evangelical groups and eventually from the state itself. To send out missionaries to India, and it's in the second decade of the 19th century that does happen. There is not forcible conversion, but Yes, yes, absolutely, they are. But in the 18th century, under the governorship of Warren Hastings, it's very much law that's administered not in the same forms as British law, but Hastings is very concerned to understand ancient Indian laws and to sort of establish or kind of continue a system of justice that. It's not about the sort of installation of a British system of justice, but something much deeper rooted in culture.
I was also, just to extend this discussion into contemporary culture, I'm sure I am not alone in being a fan of taboo, and for various reasons, which we don't need to go into here. But that was just a really, sort of an interesting way to see the East India Company come into contemporary drama and being used as this kind of site of, I guess, a display of the exotic, but very much woven again into this idea of London and a dark side of London and this, well, the taboos that are brought with contact with the East. And it was just to see that being worked through in drama. And I don't know whether you saw that and whether it had whether it resonated. Oh, Rosie, you've got to go and buy the box set now. What a treat! Did anyone else see that? Kind of. I'm not alone in my taboo, but again, I think it's sort of imagining, and of course that was a very kind of theatrical depiction of Thameside London and its docks and its trading history, but did sort of, you can imagine those intersections with. And again, the production company using these prints, using this visual culture to try and kind of weave their own imaginary 18th century London. So just that's quite an interesting connection. Mark?
Yeah, Rosie, I was struck by your focus on the John Bacon sculptural scheme, to start thinking about how that operates. An observation that it operates so high above the street and it's so hard to see. And I know you're right that I'm sure it does get, obviously, as you show, it gets reproduced in graphic form and so on. And so it will have been, to some extent, known by quite a few people through its graphic translation. But it made me think about the ways in which that pediment and its imagery speaks to all the other pediments and the other images across the tops of London and across the tops of its public buildings. And that's really the dialogue it's operating on, at one level at least. It's about a dialogue that takes place between that pediment, the one that's above the Royal Academy or the British Museum. And it would be really interesting to situate it in relation to a city-wide organisation of sculpture that happens, hundreds of feet up, as it were, across the city. And if you insert it into that imagery, into all those networks of sculpture and sculptural facades, I wonder what would come out of it and how it would be in dialogue with and in contradiction to the other kinds of pediment that you get scattered across the city at this time.
Well, that's a very interesting point. This is a period when some of the great commercial institutions are being built. The Bank of England is being rebuilt. One of the slides I had, which I skipped over due to time, was a comparison with another commercial institution, the Royal Exchange. And what really strikes me with this comparison is the legibility and the straightforwardness of East India House compared to the sort of Baroque structure of the Royal Exchange. One can, the way one's eyes focused into that pediment, and the sculptures are legible, perhaps in a way that they haven't been in the past.
Building off of Mark's question about the pediments, as you see, we saw in your discussion of the sculpture, they're very much imbued with meaning. And I'm just curious how the average person walking on the street would have responded to such a powerful message.
There's not a great deal of writing about the pediment. They're something that I have detected in some of the. Generally, the writings are within sort of tours of London, that sort of thing. It's perhaps a slight confusion, particularly around the image of the king, which is very strange. Not so much because he's in Roman dress, but because he actually doesn't look like George III, and a lot of people found that confusing. And I wonder why that is, why Bacon's image of George III doesn't really look like George III, and perhaps it's because this is supposed to have some permanence. It's supposed to just perhaps be a less literal representation of the king, so that it can kind of serve over subsequent decades and maybe even centuries, which of course it doesn't.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our allotted time together, and thank you again for such a really rich, multi-object paper. And you've taken us into so many spaces in which to think about the entangled political and visual cultures between Britain and South Asia at this moment. And there were so many connections with what Hamad and I were saying last week, and I can tell already that this is going to really connect with Sandra Kemp's paper next week as well, when she's thinking about John Lockwood Kipling and the development of art schools and institutional pedagogic practices and artistic practice operating across networks of institutions and empire. So each week we're building different narratives, different stories about how to think through this relationship. But thank you again, Rosie. That was an absolutely fantastic paper and lecture, and lots to think about. We can keep talking next week, so I hope you will all come back and join us again. And let's thank Rosie one more time.